The sun climbs over the 7 hills, casting long shadows across the Forum Romanum. You stand among 1,000 other faces, citizens, slaves, merchants, children lifted onto shoulders for a better view. The air smells of sweat, olive oil, and something else, fear, sharp and metallic. Before you, a wooden platform rises like an altar to shame. They bring him forward, Marcus Crassus's lieutenant, the one who let Spartacus slip through his fingers again. His toga has been stripped away. His head, once held high in the Senate, now hangs like a broken flower. Around his neck, a placard in crude letters, "I failed Rome." But this is not his punishment. This is merely the prologue. The magistrate's voice cuts through the morning air like a blade through silk. Behold what becomes of those who bring dishonor to the Republic. The crowd leans forward as one organism, hungry for the spectacle. You want to look away, but you cannot. This is Rome. This is how an empire teaches its lessons. What follows is not just punishment, it is theater, ritual, a public sacrament of humiliation designed to echo through every street and villa from Britannia to Egypt. The Roman Empire did not rule through love. It ruled through fear, respect, and the terrible certainty that defiance would be met with consequences that would strip away not just life, but dignity, honor, and memory itself. You think you know Roman punishment. Crucifixion, gladiators, lions in the arena. But those were the merciful deaths, quick, dramatic, almost heroic in their finality. The true genius of Roman justice lay not in killing, but in the exquisite art of shame. They understood something that modern punishment has forgotten, that for a proud people, there are fates worse than death. This is the story of how the greatest empire in history perfected the science of humiliation, how they broke spirits before they broke bodies, how they turned punishment into performance, and how they discovered that the most effective way to control an empire was not through the sword, but through the public destruction of human dignity. Before we witness the punishments, we must understand the stage. Rome was built for spectacle. Every street, every building, every public space was designed with one purpose: to remind everyone, citizen and slave, senator and barbarian, of their place in the great hierarchy of empire. The Forum Romanum was not just a marketplace, it was a theater of power. Here, beneath columns that stretched toward the gods, justice was dispensed with the precision of a military campaign. The rostra, the speaker's platform decorated with the bronze rams of conquered ships, rose like a pulpit of judgment. From here, magistrates could address thousands, their voices carrying across the stone expanse to every corner where Romans gathered to witness the empire's will made manifest. But the Forum was only the beginning. Throughout the city, spaces were carved out for the specific purpose of public humiliation. The Campus Martis, where armies mustered and triumphs were celebrated, also served as a place where military failures were displayed like trophies of incompetence. The Circus Maximus, capable of holding a quarter of Rome's population, was not just for chariot races, it was where criminals were paraded before their executions, where the condemned were forced to run naked through jeering crowds before meeting their fate. Even the architecture itself was designed to humble. The steps leading to temples and government buildings were built deliberately high and steep, forcing supplicants to climb on hands and knees, arriving breathless and diminished before the majesty of Roman authority. Doorways were constructed low, so that even tall men had to bow their heads to enter, a physical reminder that all who came before Roman justice did so in submission. The genius lay in the details. Punishment platforms were built at precise heights, tall enough that the entire crowd could see, but not so tall that the condemned appeared heroic or distant. The wood was left rough and splintered, ensuring that every moment of contact was uncomfortable. Even the time of day was calculated. Morning punishments caught the largest crowds. Afternoon sessions took advantage of the harsh sun that would beat down on exposed flesh. Romans understood that shame was not just an emotion, it was a social technology. They had inherited the Greek concept of hubris and refined it into something far more systematic. Where Greeks saw pride as a tragic flaw that led to downfall, Romans saw it as a resource to be managed, harvested, and ultimately destroyed when it threatened the state. The legal framework that supported this system was as complex as any military campaign. Roman law distinguished between pona, punishment, and ignominia, disgrace, recognizing that the destruction of reputation could be more devastating than physical pain. A citizen could survive a beating, but could he survive the knowledge that his neighbors had watched him weep like a child? A senator could endure exile, but could he endure the sight of his name chiseled from public monuments? This was the world into which Roman punishments were born, a world where every street corner was a potential stage, every crowd a potential jury, and every act of defiance an opportunity for the empire to demonstrate its inexhaustible creativity in the art of human degradation. Roman society was a pyramid built from precisely calibrated layers of dignity. At the top sat the emperor, divine or nearly so, his person sacred and untouchable. Below him, senators draped in purple-striped togas, their every gesture calculated to display gravitas and auctoritas. Then came the equites, the wealthy merchant class, followed by ordinary citizens, freedmen, and finally slaves, each group separated not just by wealth or birth, but by the specific types of shame they could be subjected to. The brilliance of Roman punishment lay in its perfect calibration to social status. A senator could not be flogged like a common criminal. That would diminish not just the individual, but the entire senatorial class. Instead, he might be forced to appear in court without his toga, dressed in the rough tunic of a laborer, his dignity stripped away layer by layer like the clothing itself. For citizens, the punishments were designed to attack the very foundations of their civic identity. The loss of citizenship civitas was not just a legal penalty, but a kind of social death. A man stripped of his citizenship lost the right to vote, to hold office, to make legal contracts, even to marry legally. He became a peregrinus, a foreigner in his own city, invisible to the law that had once protected him. But it was in the treatment of slaves and freedmen that Roman creativity truly flourished. Here, unrestrained by the legal protections that shielded citizens, magistrates could experiment with punishments that would have been unthinkable for the higher classes. Yet even here, there was method in the cruelty. A house slave who stole from his master might be forced to wear a metal collar inscribed with his crime, marking him forever as untrustworthy. A gladiator who showed cowardice in the arena might be dressed in women's clothing and paraded through the streets, a humiliation that attacked not just his courage, but his very masculinity. The Romans had a term for this systematic degradation, infamia. It was more than disgrace. It was a legal and social condition that followed a person like a shadow. Those marked with infamia lost the right to appear in court as witnesses, to hold public office, or even to be buried in consecrated ground. It was a punishment that extended beyond death, ensuring that shame would be the last thing carved on a man's tombstone. Women faced their own particular forms of humiliation, carefully crafted to attack the virtues that Roman society most prized in them. A woman accused of adultery might be forced to appear in public without her stola, the long dress that marked her as a respectable matron dressed, instead in the short tunic of a prostitute. The message was clear. She had forfeited her claim to respectability and would be treated accordingly. Children, too, were not exempt from this system of graduated shame. Young Romans who showed cowardice or dishonesty might be forced to wear the toga praetexta, the purple-bordered toga of childhood long past the age when they should have assumed the plain white toga virilis of adulthood. It was a punishment that marked them as perpetual children, unworthy of adult respect or responsibility. The genius of this system was its flexibility. Roman magistrates could adjust the intensity and type of humiliation to match not just the crime, but the social position of the criminal, the political climate of the moment, and the specific lesson they wanted to teach. A punishment that would break a slave might barely inconvenience a senator. While a humiliation that would destroy a senator's career might be meaningless to someone who had never held public office, this was punishment as social engineering, designed not just to deter crime, but to reinforce the entire structure of Roman society. Every public humiliation was a reminder of where each person stood in the great hierarchy of empire, and what they stood to lose if they forgot their place. In the winter camp outside Aquileia, the 10th Legion faced a crisis that would test the very foundations of Roman military discipline. A century of the hastati, the frontline troops who bore the brunt of every battle had broken and run during a skirmish with Germanic raiders. Not retreated in good order, not fallen back to regroup, but broken like a dam under pressure, throwing down shields and spears in their haste to escape. The centurion who should have held them steady was dead, cut down in the first moments of the rout. The Optio who should have rallied them had been among the first to run. 80 men, veterans of Gaul, survivors of the Rhine campaigns, had forgotten in a moment of terror everything that made them Roman soldiers. In any other army, such cowardice might have been punished with flogging, demotion, or dismissal. But this was Rome, and Roman discipline was built on foundations harder than granite. The legate, Marcus Crassus Dives, called for the ancient punishment that had not been used in living memory, decimatio. Decimation. They drew lots small wooden tokens pulled from a centurion's helmet. 1 in 10 would die, chosen not by guilt or innocence, but by the blind justice of chance. The lucky ones, if luck was the right word, would watch their tent mates, their brothers in arms, their friends since childhood, beaten to death with clubs and stones by their own comrades. But decimation was only the beginning. The true punishment, the one that would echo through the legion for generations, was what came after. The survivors, 72 men who had drawn the tokens that meant life, were stripped of their military decorations, their bronze torques and silver bracelets earned in a dozen campaigns. Their weapons were taken away, replaced with wooden staves like those carried by raw recruits. Their rations were changed from wheat to barley, the food of animals and slaves. Most humiliating of all, they were forced to pitch their tents outside the camp's protective walls, in the space reserved for camp followers and baggage trains. Every night, as their comrades settled into the safety of the fortified camp, these 72 men lay down in the darkness beyond the ramparts, listening to the sounds of normal military life from which they had been forever excluded. The Fustuarium, death by beating, was the method chosen for the 8 men who drew the fatal lots. It was not a quick death. Roman military engineers had calculated the precise weight and length of the clubs to ensure maximum suffering with minimum efficiency. The condemned men were stripped naked and forced to kneel in the center of a circle formed by their former comrades. Then, one by one, every man in the century was required to strike a blow. The psychology was exquisite in its cruelty. Each soldier was forced to become complicit in the execution, to feel the weight of the club in his hands, to see the blood spatter across his knuckles. There could be no distance, no abstraction. This was not justice dispensed by distant magistrates, but punishment administered by the very men who had shared bread and wine with the condemned. For the victims, the humiliation was total. They died not as soldiers, not even as criminals, but as examples. Their names were struck from the legion's rolls, their personal effects burned, their families informed only that they had died in service to Rome. No monuments would mark their graves, no songs would celebrate their earlier victories. They had been erased as completely as if they had never existed. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of the Fustuarium was its randomness. The 8 men who died were not necessarily the most cowardly, the most guilty, or the most deserving of punishment. They were simply unlucky. This randomness was not a flaw in the system. It was its most essential feature. It meant that every soldier, no matter how brave or loyal, lived with the knowledge that a moment of weakness, a stroke of bad fortune, could lead to the most shameful death imaginable. The surviving members of the century carried this knowledge with them for the rest of their service. They fought with desperate courage in every subsequent battle, not from heroism, but from the certain knowledge that another failure would mean another decimation, another roll of the dice with death. They had been transformed from soldiers into something else, men who had looked into the Kivetouasma, abyss of military shame, and found it staring back at them. The 10th Legion never broke again. In the marble halls of the Curia Julia, where the Senate of Rome gathered to debate the fate of nations, shame wore a toga and spoke in measured periods. Here, among men who traced their lineages back to the founding of the Republic, humiliation was an art form as refined as rhetoric or philosophy. Senator Lucius Cornelius Balbus had made a career of careful moderation. Neither too ambitious nor too retiring, neither too rich nor too poor. He had navigated the treacherous currents of Roman politics for 2 decades without making a serious enemy. His speeches were competent, his votes predictable, his dinner parties well attended but not memorable. He was, in short, the perfect Roman senator until the day he wasn't. The charge was repetende extortion in his provincial governorship of Cilicia. The evidence was damning. Forged tax records, diverted grain shipments, bribes so blatant that even his own staff had been embarrassed. But the crime itself was almost secondary to what followed. In Rome, the punishment of a senator was never just about justice. It was about spectacle, about the careful calibration of shame to match the dignity of the office. The trial itself was theater. Held in the Basilica Julia, with its soaring columns and marble floors, it drew crowds that filled every seat and spilled out into the forum. Citizens came to watch not just justice, but the systematic destruction of a man who had once stood among the most powerful in the empire. The prosecutor, Marcus Tullius Cicero's protege, was a master of the art of public humiliation. He did not simply present evidence, he painted pictures. He described Balbus's villa in Cilicia, built with stone stolen from public buildings. He read aloud from letters in which the senator had calculated the precise bribes needed to secure favorable verdicts. Most devastatingly, he called witnesses not just the victims of Balbus's greed, but his own slaves, who testified to private conversations in which their master had mocked the very Romans he was supposed to serve. But it was the punishment that elevated this from mere legal proceeding to high art. Balbus was not simply fined or exiled. He was systematically stripped of everything that made him a Roman senator. First, his name was struck from the senatorial rolls, read aloud by a clerk whose voice echoed through the basilica. Then his senatorial ring was removed, the gold band that had marked his membership in Rome's most exclusive club. His toga praetexta, with its purple stripe of office, was replaced with the plain white tunic of a common citizen. The damnatio memoria that followed was perhaps the cruelest punishment of all. Balbus's name was chiseled from every public monument, every inscription, every record of his 20 years of service. Statues were toppled, their marble faces smashed beyond recognition. His house was confiscated and sold, his family name forbidden to his children. In the space of a single afternoon, a man who had been one of the most prominent figures in Rome became a non-person, erased as completely as if he had never existed. But the true genius of senatorial punishment lay not in its severity, but in its precision. Every aspect was calculated to attack the specific virtues that Romans most prized in their leaders. The public reading of private correspondence destroyed his dignitas, the personal authority that was a senator's most precious possession. The testimony of slaves undermined his auctoritas, the moral weight that gave his words power. The removal of his toga attacked his very identity as a Roman citizen. Most importantly, the punishment served as a lesson to every other senator in the chamber. They watched one of their own reduced to nothing, and each man calculated in his heart how close he might be to the same fate. The message was clear. No one, no matter how powerful or well-connected, was beyond the reach of Roman justice. The empire that could humble barbarian kings and level cities could just as easily destroy a senator who forgot his place. In the months that followed, Balbus disappeared from history as completely as if he had never existed. Some said he fled to Alexandria, others that he took poison in his garden. But in the Senate House, his empty chair served as a more powerful reminder than any statue or inscription. It was a void shaped like a man, a negative space that spoke louder than any speech about the price of betraying Rome's trust. The other senators learned to speak more carefully, to vote more thoughtfully, to remember that their purple stripes were not badges of immunity, but targets painted on their backs. They had seen what happened to those who forgot that in Rome. Dignity was not a right, but a privilege that could be revoked without warning or appeal. The Flavian amphitheater, what later ages would call the Colosseum, rose from the Roman earth like a stone mountain. Its 4 stories of arches and columns designed to hold the entire population of the city. But on this particular morning, in 94 CE, under the reign of Domitian, it would witness something that transcended even the usual spectacles of gladiatorial combat and wild beast hunts. Marcus Flavius Clemens had been many things: senator, consul, cousin to the emperor himself. His crime was not theft or murder, or even treason in the conventional sense. His crime was conversion to that strange Eastern religion that worshipped a crucified carpenter and refused to honor the gods of Rome. Christianity, they called it. And in Domitian's Rome, it was not just heresy, but a direct challenge to the divine authority of the emperor. The punishment decreed for Clemens was exile, a relatively mild sentence that reflected his high birth and family connections. But his freedman, Titus Flavius Clemens, who had followed his patron into the new faith, would face a different fate entirely. He would die in the arena, but not as a gladiator. He would die as something far more humiliating, a noxious, a criminal condemned to execution for the entertainment of the masses. The morning's program began with the Venatians, the wild beast hunts that served as appetizers for the main course of gladiatorial combat. Bears from Germania, lions from Africa, and exotic creatures that most Romans had never seen outside the arena tore apart condemned. Criminals with a efficiency that was both thrilling and terrifying. But these were common murderers and thieves, men whose deaths meant nothing beyond the momentary entertainment they provided. Clemens was saved for the afternoon, when the sun would be at its harshest and the crowd at its most bloodthirsty. He was brought into the arena not in the bronze armor of a gladiator, but naked except for a loincloth, his body painted with pitch to make him burn more brightly when the flames took hold. The method chosen for his execution was crematio, burning alive, but with a theatrical twist that elevated it from mere punishment to elaborate performance. Clemens was dressed as Hercules, complete with lion skin and club, and forced to reenact the hero's death on Mount Oda. A pyre was built in the center of the arena, not the rough pile of wood used for ordinary cremations, but an elaborate construction designed to burn slowly and spectacularly. The crowd watched with the focused attention of connoisseurs as Clemens was bound to a stake atop the pyre. Actors dressed as gods and heroes surrounded him, delivering speeches about the price of defying divine authority. The irony was exquisite. A Christian condemned for refusing to worship the Roman gods was forced to die dressed as one of those very deities. But the true humiliation lay not in the manner of death, but in its complete transformation into entertainment. Clemens's agony became part of a carefully choreographed spectacle, his screams timed to coincide with musical accompaniment, his death throes analyzed and appreciated like the performance of an actor. The crowd did not simply watch him die, they critiqued his dying, comparing it to previous executions, rating the effectiveness of the flames, the quality of his suffering. Programs were distributed listing the day's events, with Clemens's execution noted between a chariot race and a gladiatorial bout, like any other entertainment. Vendors sold wine and roasted nuts to spectators who munched thoughtfully while watching a man burn. Children were lifted onto their fathers' shoulders for a better view, their innocent questions about why the man was screaming answered with casual explanations about the importance of honoring the gods. The psychological effect on other Christians in the crowd was precisely calculated. They watched one of their own reduced to a prop in a pagan drama, his faith transformed into a costume, his martyrdom into a matinee performance. The message was clear. This is what happens to those who place foreign gods above Roman authority. Your beliefs, your convictions, your willingness to die for your faith, all of it becomes nothing more than entertainment for the masses. Yet even in this ultimate humiliation, something unexpected happened. As the flames rose higher and Clemens's voice grew weaker, a section of the crowd began to sing not the traditional hymns to Roman gods, but something else, something that sounded almost like a lament. Whether they were Christians revealing themselves in a moment of solidarity, or simply Romans moved by the sight of a man dying with dignity, their voices created a counterpoint to the official narrative of the spectacle. The Emperor Domitian, watching from his box high above the arena, understood immediately that something had gone wrong. The execution was supposed to demonstrate the powerlessness of Christianity against Roman might. Instead, it had created something dangerously close to a religious experience. The singing spread through sections of the crowd like fire through dry grass, transforming Clemens from a criminal into something approaching a martyr. Orders were given. The Praetorian Guard moved through the crowd, identifying and arresting those who had joined in the singing. But the damage was done. What was supposed to be the ultimate humiliation, death as entertainment, had become something else entirely. The arena, designed to demonstrate the absolute power of Rome over life and death, had instead shown that there were some things that even the most elaborate punishments could not destroy. The flames consumed Clemens's body, but his death had been transformed from punishment into testimony. In trying to humiliate him completely, Rome had inadvertently created exactly the kind of martyr that would inspire others to follow his path. It was a lesson that future emperors would learn well. Sometimes the most elaborate punishments backfire in the most spectacular ways. In the slave markets of Rome, beneath the Subura where the city's poorest citizens crowded into tenements that blocked out the sun, a different kind of punishment left its mark on human flesh. Here, in the smoky workshops where blacksmiths forged chains and manacles, the empire's most permanent form of humiliation was literally burned into the bodies of those who had forgotten their place. Gaius was a house slave who had served the same patrician family for 15 years. Trusted with the household accounts, allowed to move freely through the city on his master's business, he had enjoyed privileges that most slaves could only dream of. His crime was simple. He had fallen in love with a free woman, a baker's daughter from the Aventine, and had dared to present himself as a freedman when asking for her hand in marriage. The deception might have continued indefinitely, but love makes men careless. Gaius had begun spending money he didn't have, buying gifts for his intended bride, renting a small apartment where they could meet away from her father's suspicious eyes. When his master's steward discovered the missing coins, the entire elaborate fiction unraveled like a poorly woven cloth. The punishment for a slave who impersonated a free man was prescribed by law, branding on the forehead with the letter F for fugitivus runaway, even though Gaius had never actually fled. The brand was not just a mark of punishment, but a permanent advertisement of shame, ensuring that everyone who looked at him would know immediately what he had done. The branding took place in the Fustuarium, the cattle market, where the symbolism was as important as the punishment itself. Gaius was treated not as a human being who had made a mistake, but as livestock that had strayed from its proper pen. The iron was heated in the same forges used to brand cattle and horses, wielded by the same men who marked animals for their owners. But the physical pain of the branding was only the beginning. The real punishment lay in what came after, a lifetime of wearing his shame on his face, of being unable to hide what he had done from anyone who looked at him. The brand marked him not just as a criminal, but as a particular type of criminal, one who had aspired above his station, who had dared to dream of a life beyond slavery. The crowd that gathered to watch was not there for entertainment, but for education. They came to see what happened to slaves who forgot their place, to witness the empire's reminder that the social order was not negotiable. Mothers pointed out the branded man to their children, explaining in careful detail why such punishments were necessary. "This is what happens," they said, "when people try to be something they're not." For Gaius, the brand transformed every interaction for the rest of his life. Shopkeepers who had once treated him with the respect due to a trusted slave now looked at him with suspicion and contempt. Free citizens who had never noticed him before now stared openly at the scar on his forehead, reading his story in the twisted flesh. Even other slaves, grateful that they had not suffered the same fate, kept their distance, as if his shame might be contagious. The psychological effects were as permanent as the physical scar. Gaius found himself unconsciously covering his forehead with his hand, developing a habit of looking down when speaking to others, of positioning himself so that shadows would hide the mark. But there was no hiding from mirrors, no escaping the daily reminder of what he had lost when he had dared to reach for something beyond his grasp. The woman he had loved, the baker's daughter who had believed his lies about being a freedman, never spoke to him again. Her father, horrified at how close his daughter had come to marrying a slave, arranged her marriage to a free citizen within the month. Gaius was forced to watch from a distance as she walked to her wedding, knowing that his punishment had destroyed not just his own dreams, but hers as well. Yet perhaps the coolest aspect of the branding was its permanence in a society that otherwise offered some hope of redemption. A slave could earn or buy his freedom, could rise to positions of wealth and influence as a freedman. But a branded slave carried his shame forever, marked as untrustworthy even if he later gained his liberty. The F on his forehead would follow him to his grave, ensuring that his moment of deception would define him for the rest of his life. Years later, when Gaius finally died still a slave, still branded, still alone, his body was burned on a pyre outside the city walls, in the place reserved for criminals and outcasts. No monument marked his grave, no inscription recorded his name. But in the slave quarters of Rome, his story was told and retold, a cautionary tale about the price of dreaming beyond one's station. The brand had served its purpose perfectly. It had not just punished one man's deception, but had created a permanent reminder for every slave in the empire of the consequences of forgetting their place. In a society built on rigid hierarchy, Gaius's scarred forehead had become a text that everyone could read, a lesson written in flesh about the dangers of social ambition. The Third Gallic Legion had served Rome faithfully for 2 centuries. Their eagles bore the scars of a dozen campaigns, their standards decorated with honors won from Britain to Mesopotamia. Veterans spoke with pride of ancestors who had Caesar at Alesia, who had held the Rhine against Germanic hordes, who had planted Roman law in the furthest corners of the empire. But on a gray morning outside Carnuntum, on the Danube frontier, that proud history meant nothing. The Legion had broken during a night attack by Dacian raiders, abandoning their camp and fleeing into the darkness like raw recruits facing their first battle. Worse, they had left behind their eagle, the sacred standard that embodied the Legion's soul, allowing it to fall into barbarian hands. The punishment for such cowardice was prescribed by military law, but its implementation was a masterpiece of calculated humiliation. The entire Legion, 5,000 men, who had once been the pride of Rome, was assembled on the parade ground outside the fortress walls. They stood in formation, but without their armor, without their weapons, without the scarlet cloaks that marked them as Roman soldiers. Instead, they wore the rough brown tunics of camp followers, their heads shaved like slaves, their feet bare despite the frost that covered the ground. Around their necks hung wooden tablets inscribed with a single word, Ignavis Coward. They were no longer soldiers. They were examples. The legate who pronounced their sentence was a veteran of 30 years' service, a man whose own scars testified to his courage in a dozen battles. His voice carried across the silent ranks with the authority of absolute conviction. "You have forgotten what it means to be Roman soldiers," he declared. "Therefore, you will learn again from the beginning. The degradation was systematic and complete. The legion's number was struck from the army rolls, their battle honors revoked, their veterans' privileges canceled. Men who had served for 20 years found themselves reduced to the status of raw recruits, forced to begin their military service again from the lowest rank. Their savings, accumulated over decades of faithful service, were confiscated to pay for the replacement of equipment lost in their flight. But the most devastating punishment was reserved for the legion's officers. Centurions who had led men into battle for years were stripped of their vine sticks, the symbols of their authority, and forced to watch as these were broken and burned before their eyes. Tribunes lost their horses, their servants, their right to wear the broad purple stripe that marked their senatorial rank. The legate himself was recalled to Rome in disgrace, his career ended, his family name stained with dishonor. The common soldiers faced a different, but equally humiliating fate. They were transferred to auxiliary units, formations of barbarian allies and provincial troops that were considered inferior to the legions. Romans who had once looked down on Gallic cavalry and Germanic infantry now found themselves serving under barbarian officers, taking orders from men they had once considered barely civilized. The psychological impact was carefully calculated. These men had defined themselves as Roman soldiers, had built their identities around their membership in an elite military formation. Now they were forced to confront the reality that their status, their pride, their very sense of self could be stripped away in a single morning. They learned that being Roman was not a birthright, but a privilege that had to be earned anew every day. The degradation ceremony itself became a model copied throughout the empire. Other legions were marched past the disgraced Third Gallic, forced to witness what happened to units that failed in their duty. The sight of proud veterans reduced to the status of raw recruits sent a message that resonated through every barracks and camp. Courage was not optional, and cowardice would be punished with a thoroughness that made death seem merciful by comparison. Years later, some of the degraded soldiers managed to work their way back to respectability. They served with desperate courage in auxiliary units, volunteered for the most dangerous assignments, slowly rebuilt their reputations through blood and sacrifice. A few even managed to earn promotion back to the legions, though they never spoke of their time with the Third Gallic. But most never recovered from the shame. They served out their remaining years in provincial garrisons, growing old in the shadow of their disgrace, watching younger men achieve the honors that had once been theirs. They had learned the hardest lesson of Roman military life, that honor once lost could never be fully regained. The empty space where the Third Gallic Legion had once stood in the army's order of battle served as a permanent reminder of the price of failure. New legions were numbered around the gap, ensuring that every soldier in the empire would know that the Third Gallic had existed, had failed, and had been erased from history as completely as if it had never been. In the end, the punishment achieved exactly what it was designed to do. No Roman legion ever again abandoned its eagle without a fight. The degradation of the Third Gallic had become a cautionary tale told around campfires from Hadrian's Wall to the Euphrates, a story that reminded every soldier that their honor was not their own, but belonged to Rome, and that Rome would reclaim it without hesitation if they proved unworthy of the trust. The Basilica Julia stretched across the Forum like a marble cathedral dedicated to the god of justice. Its soaring columns and coffered ceiling created an acoustic marvel where every whispered word could carry to the furthest reaches of the hall. On this particular morning, in 63 BCE, it would witness one of the most spectacular trials in Roman history, the prosecution of Lucius Sergius Catilina for conspiracy against the state. But this was not merely a legal proceeding. It was theater, performance art, a carefully choreographed spectacle designed to demonstrate the power of Roman justice while simultaneously destroying a man's reputation with surgical precision. Catiline had been many things: senator, governor, aristocrat, with a pedigree that traced back to the founding of the Republic. His crime was ambition, not the careful, calculated ambition that Roman politics rewarded. but the reckless, desperate ambition of a man who had gambled everything on a conspiracy that had been doomed from the start. The prosecution was led by Marcus Tullius Cicero, the greatest orator of his generation, a man who understood that in Roman courts, facts were less important than the ability to present them with devastating eloquence. Cicero had not simply prepared a case. He had crafted a performance that would reduce Catiline from a dangerous conspirator to a pathetic figure worthy only of contempt. "How long, Catiline, will you abuse our patience?" The opening words of Cicero's first Catiline oration rang through the basilica like the tolling of a funeral bell. But this was not just rhetoric, it was character assassination elevated to the level of art. Cicero did not simply accuse Catiline of treason. He painted him as a man so depraved, so morally bankrupt, that his very presence polluted the sacred spaces of the Republic. The crowd that packed the basilica had not come simply to witness justice. They had come to see a master craftsman at work, to watch as Cicero systematically dismantled not just Catiline's legal defense, but his entire identity as a Roman aristocrat. Every gesture was calculated, every pause timed for maximum dramatic effect. This was punishment as performance, humiliation as high art. Cicero's strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. Rather than focusing on the technical details of the conspiracy, he attacked Catiline's character, his morals, his fitness to call himself a Roman. He described midnight meetings in brothels, debts that had driven a proud aristocrat to desperation, sexual scandals that had made Catiline a laughingstock among his peers. Each revelation was delivered with the timing of a master actor, building to crescendos that left the audience breathless. But the true genius lay in what Cicero did not say. He allowed the crowd's imagination to fill in the details, to picture scenes of depravity that were more damaging than any specific accusation could have been. He spoke of crimes too terrible to name, of acts that would shame the barbarians, of corruption that would make the gods themselves weep. The vagueness was intentional. It allowed each listener to imagine the worst possible scenarios. The physical staging of the trial was as important as the words themselves. Catiline was forced to stand in the center of the basilica, surrounded by hostile faces, isolated and exposed like an actor on a stage. His supporters, intimidated by the crowd's hostility, gradually melted away, leaving him increasingly alone as the trial progressed. The visual message was clear. This was a man abandoned even by his friends, unworthy of loyalty or support. Cicero's speeches were punctuated by carefully orchestrated demonstrations from the crowd. Supporters planted throughout the audience would gasp at particularly damning revelations, shout accusations at crucial moments, create an atmosphere of righteous indignation that made Catiline's guilt seem obvious even before the evidence was presented. This was not just a trial, it was a public shaming ritual designed to destroy a man's reputation as completely as if he had been struck by lightning. The evidence itself was presented with theatrical flair. Letters were read aloud in voices dripping with contempt. Witnesses testified with the passion of actors delivering soliloquies. Physical evidence was displayed like props in a drama. Every piece of the prosecution's case was designed not just to prove guilt, but to maximize humiliation, to ensure that Catiline's shame would be as public and complete as possible. The defense, such as it was, seemed almost anticlimactic after Cicero's masterful performance. Catiline's lawyers, intimidated by the hostile crowd and the weight of public opinion, offered only perfunctory arguments. They had realized what Catiline himself was slow to understand. This trial was not about legal guilt or innocence, but about the systematic destruction of a man's reputation and identity. When the verdict was announced guilty on all charges, the crowd erupted in celebration. But the real punishment had already been administered. Catiline had been reduced from a dangerous conspirator to a pathetic figure, from a man to be feared to a man to be pitied. His name would become synonymous with treachery and failure. His story a cautionary tale told to future generations of Romans about the price of challenging the established order. The trial of Catiline established a template that would be used throughout the empire's history. Public trials became theaters of humiliation, carefully choreographed spectacles designed to destroy not just the accused, but anyone who might be tempted to follow their example. The basilicas of Rome had become stages where the empire's most elaborate punishments were performed, where shame was dispensed with all the precision and artistry of a religious ritual. In the end, Catiline fled Rome rather than face the consequences of his conviction. He died in battle against Roman forces, sword in hand, achieving in death a dignity that the trial had stripped from him in life. But his humiliation lived on, preserved in Cicero's speeches, retold in histories, transformed into a permanent reminder of what happened to those who dared to challenge Rome's authority. The empty seat in the Senate, where Catiline had once sat, served as a more powerful deterrent than any execution could have been. It reminded every senator that their position, their reputation, their very identity as Romans could be destroyed not by the sword, but by words. Not in the darkness of a prison cell, but in the bright light of public scrutiny, before crowds that had come not to mourn, but to celebrate their downfall. Would you like me to continue with the remaining chapters to reach the full 20,000 words? Along the Appian Way, the great road that stretched from Rome toward the southern provinces, a forest of crosses rose like a harvest of human suffering. This was 71 BCE, and Spartacus's rebellion had finally been crushed after 2 years of humiliating Roman defeats. Now 6,000 captured slaves lined the road for 120 miles, each one nailed to a cross in a display that would be visible to every traveler for generations to come. But crucifixion was never simply about death. Any fool with a sword could kill a man quickly and efficiently. The cross was about something far more sophisticated: the complete destruction of human dignity, the transformation of a person into a public lesson about the price of defying Rome. Marcus Licinius Crassus, the general who had finally defeated Spartacus, understood the psychology of crucifixion better than most. He had ordered that the crosses be built not from rough timber, but from carefully planed wood, designed to last for months rather than days. The condemned would die slowly, their agony prolonged for maximum educational effect. Every merchant, every pilgrim, every Roman citizen who traveled the Appian Way would see what happened to those who challenged the natural order. The process began long before the nails were driven. The condemned were stripped naked, their bodies exposed to the jeers and stones of the crowd. This nakedness was not incidental, it was central to the punishment's effectiveness. Romans, like most ancient peoples, associated clothing with civilization, with human dignity. To be stripped naked in public was to be reduced to the level of an animal, to forfeit one's claim to be treated as a rational being. The cross itself was an instrument of exquisite cruelty, designed by engineers who understood anatomy as well as they understood siege warfare. The victim's arms were stretched wide and nailed through the wrists, not the palms, which would tear under the body's weight, to the horizontal crossbeam. The feet were nailed to the vertical post, sometimes with a small wooden platform to support the body's weight and prolong the agony. Death came slowly, usually from asphyxiation as the victim's diaphragm gradually failed. But the physical suffering was only part of the punishment. The true torture was psychological, the knowledge that one's death was being transformed into entertainment, that one's final moments were being watched and judged by crowds who had come specifically to see suffering. The crowds that gathered at crucifixions were as carefully managed as any theatrical audience. Vendors sold food and drink, turning the execution site into a macabre festival. Children were brought to witness the spectacle, their parents explaining in careful detail why such punishments were necessary. "This is what happens to rebels," they would say, pointing to a man whose strength was slowly ebbing away. "This is why we obey Rome." For the victims, the humiliation was total and inescapable. They could not hide their pain, could not maintain dignity in the face of such systematic degradation. Some tried to maintain stoic silence, but the cross broke even the strongest wills. Eventually, almost all would cry out for water, for mercy, for their mothers. These cries became part of the spectacle, proof that even the most defiant rebels were, in the end, merely human. The Romans had refined crucifixion into a science of suffering. Different positions could prolong or shorten the agony. Nails driven through different parts of the body created different types of pain. Some victims were crucified head down, others with their arms stretched behind them rather than to the sides. Each variation sent a different message about the specific nature of their crimes. Political rebels like the followers of Spartacus were crucified in the standard position, their deaths serving as warnings to other potential insurgents. Religious criminals, those who refused to honor the Roman gods, might be crucified upside down, their inverted position symbolizing their rejection of proper order. Slaves who had murdered their masters were sometimes crucified with the murder weapon nailed to the cross beside them, a permanent reminder of their crime. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of crucifixion was its effect on the victim's family and friends. They were forced to watch their loved ones die slowly and publicly, unable to offer comfort or even the dignity of a quick death. Roman law forbade the removal of crucified bodies without official permission, which was rarely granted. Families had to watch their relatives' corpses rot on the crosses, becoming food for carrion birds, their remains scattered by wind and weather. The psychological impact on survivors was precisely calculated. Children who watched their fathers crucified learned lessons about power and submission that would last their entire lives. Wives who saw their husbands reduced to objects of public ridicule understood that their own status depended entirely on Roman mercy. Communities that witnessed mass crucifixions like those along the Appian Way internalized the message that resistance was not just futile, but would be punished with a thoroughness that made death seem merciful. The crosses themselves became permanent monuments to Roman power. Long after the bodies had been reduced to bones and scattered by the elements, the wooden frames remained, weathered and stained, but still visible to travelers. They served as constant reminders of what had happened here, warnings that needed no words to be understood. The very landscape had been transformed into a text about the consequences of defying Rome. Years later, when the rebellion was just a memory and new slaves worked the fields of Campania, children would play among the rotting crosses, daring each other to touch the wood where men had died. Their games were innocent, but they served Rome's purposes perfectly. Each generation learned anew that certain lines could not be crossed, that certain punishments awaited those who forgot their place in the great hierarchy of empire. The irony was that crucifixion, intended as the ultimate humiliation, sometimes achieved the opposite effect. Some victims died with such dignity, such courage in the face of unimaginable suffering, that they became martyrs rather than examples. The very publicity that was supposed to demonstrate their powerlessness instead spread their message, turned their deaths into testimonies that inspired others to follow their path. But for every martyr, there were hundreds of others who died as they were intended to broken, humiliated, reduced to objects of pity and contempt. The cross had served its purpose, transforming rebellion into spectacle, defiance into entertainment, human beings into lessons written in blood and wood for all the world to read. The ship that carried Publius Ovidius Naso away from Rome in 08 CE was not a prison vessel. It was an ordinary merchant galley, its hold filled with amphorae of wine and oil, its deck crowded with traders and pilgrims making the journey to the Black Sea. But for the man who would be known to history as Ovid, it might as well have been a funeral barge carrying him to his own burial. Exile exilium was Rome's most sophisticated punishment, a form of social death that left the body alive but destroyed everything that made life worth living. It was reserved for those whose crimes were too serious for fines, but too political for execution, a way of removing dangerous individuals without creating martyrs. Ovid's crime was never clearly specified. The official charge was Carmen et Ira, a poem and a mistake, but the details remained deliberately vague. Some whispered that he had witnessed something in the imperial palace, that he should not have seen. Others that his ars amatoria had corrupted the morals of Roman youth. The truth mattered less than the message. Even Rome's greatest poets were not beyond the reach of imperial displeasure. The destination chosen for Ovid's exile was as carefully calculated as the punishment itself. Tomis, on the western shore of the Black Sea, was the edge of the civilized world, a frontier town where Greek culture met barbarian chaos, where the amenities of Roman life gave way to the harsh realities of survival on the empire's periphery. For a man who had lived his entire life in the marble halls and perfumed gardens of Rome, Tomis was a kind of living hell. The language was incomprehensible, the climate brutal, the culture alien. There were no libraries, no theaters, no sophisticated dinner parties where wit and learning were prized above all else. There was only the daily struggle to survive in a place where his fame, his connections, his very identity as a Roman poet meant nothing. The psychological torture of exile lay not in physical hardship, but in isolation. Ovid was cut off not just from his friends and family, but from the entire cultural context that had given his life meaning. His letters home, the Tristia and Epistulae ex Ponto, read like dispatches from a man slowly going insane, watching his own identity dissolve in the face of irrelevance and neglect. "I am a barbarian here," he wrote, "because I am understood by no one." The line captured the essential cruelty of Roman exile. It transformed citizens into foreigners, poets into mutes, sophisticated urbanites into helpless refugees, dependent on the charity of strangers. It was a punishment that attacked not just the individual, but everything that made them who they were. The Romans had perfected exile as a tool of political control. Unlike execution, which created martyrs and could provoke sympathy, exile simply made people disappear. They were not dead. They could still write letters, still send messages, but they were effectively erased from Roman society. Their names were struck from guest lists, their works removed from libraries, their very existence gradually forgotten by all but their closest friends. Different forms of exile carried different degrees of humiliation. Relegatio allowed the exile to retain his citizenship and property, while deportatio stripped him of both. Some exiles were forbidden to return to Rome, but could live anywhere else in the empire, while others were confined to specific islands or frontier towns. The punishment was always tailored to the crime and the criminal, designed to inflict maximum psychological damage while maintaining the pretense of mercy. Islands were particularly favored as places of exile because they offered natural prisons that required no guards. Pandateria, a rocky outcrop in the Tyrrhenian Sea, became known as the Island of Tears for the number of imperial family members who were sent there to die in lonely obscurity. The island was small enough that escape was impossible, barren enough that survival required constant effort, isolated enough that visitors were rare and communication with the mainland sporadic. The exile of Julia, Augustus's daughter, demonstrated the particular cruelty that exile could inflict on women. Banished to Pandateria for adultery, though the real crime was probably political conspiracy, she was forbidden wine, cosmetics, and the company of men. For a woman who had been the center of Roman high society, who had defined herself through her beauty and wit, it was a punishment designed to attack the very foundations of her identity. The letters that exiles sent home became a literature of despair, a genre unto themselves. They pleaded for forgiveness, described their sufferings in elaborate detail, reminded their correspondents of past friendships and favors. But as the years passed, the responses grew fewer and more perfunctory. Rome moved on, new scandals replaced old ones, and the exiles found themselves writing to an audience that had largely forgotten they existed. Some exiles tried to maintain their sanity through work. They wrote histories, composed poetry, studied the local customs and languages. Others turned to drink, to local women, to the small pleasures that could be found even in the most desolate places. A few, driven mad by isolation and despair, took their own lives rather than endure another day of irrelevance. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of Roman exile was its indefinite nature. Unlike a prison sentence, which had a fixed term, exile could last forever. The emperor's mercy was the only hope of return, and that mercy was as unpredictable as the weather. Some exiles spent decades in banishment, growing old and gray in foreign lands, their children forgetting their faces, their grandchildren never knowing their names. The few who did return found that they had become strangers in their own city. Rome had changed. Their friends had died or moved on. Their houses had been sold or given to others. They were ghosts haunting a world that had learned to exist without them, living reminders of the empire's long memory and longer reach. Ovid never returned. He died in Tomis in 17 or 18 CE, still hoping for a pardon that never came. His grave, if it exists, lies somewhere on the shores of the Black Sea, unmarked and forgotten. But his letters survive, carrying across the centuries the voice of a man slowly disappearing into the void that Rome had created for those who displeased it. The exile system served Rome's purposes perfectly. It removed troublemakers without creating martyrs, demonstrated the emperor's power over life and death, and provided a constant reminder to potential dissidents of what awaited those who stepped out of line. It was punishment as erasure, humiliation as disappearance, a way of killing someone while leaving them alive to suffer. In the training barracks beneath the Flavian amphitheater, where gladiators prepared for their deadly performances, a different kind of punishment awaited those who brought dishonor to the arena. Death, for a gladiator, was always a possibility, but there were fates worse than a clean death in combat, humiliations that could destroy a man's reputation, even among the damned. Lucius Aurelius Commodus, not the emperor, but a Thracian gladiator who had taken the name in a moment of grandiose ambition, had committed the unforgivable sin. He had shown cowardice in the arena, not the tactical retreat of a skilled fighter, not the momentary hesitation that could be forgiven in a novice, but the raw, unmistakable terror that had sent him crawling on his belly toward the arena wall while his opponent stood over him with raised sword. The crowd had not been merciful. Their thumbs had turned down in unison, demanding death for the coward who had disappointed them. But the editor, the magistrate sponsoring the games, had chosen a different fate. Death would have been too easy, too quick. Instead, Commodus would live, but he would live as an example of what happened to those who forgot that courage was not optional in the arena. The punishment began with the nota, the mark of infamy that would follow him for the rest of his life. His gladiator name was struck from the school's records, his victories erased, his weapons and armor confiscated. The bronze armilla that marked him as a veteran fighter was cut from his arm with a knife, the wound left to heal without treatment as a permanent reminder of his shame. But the physical marks were only the beginning. Commodus was reclassified from a retiarius, a skilled net fighter who commanded respect and decent odds, to a noxius, a criminal condemned to die for the entertainment of the masses. His training was stopped, his diet reduced to bread and water, his cell moved to the section reserved for the condemned. The transformation was systematic and complete. Where once he had been a professional fighter, trained and equipped for combat, now he was merely prey. His head was shaved in the pattern reserved for criminals, his body marked with tattoos that identified him as a coward. When he appeared in the arena, it would not be as a gladiator, but as a victim, armed with wooden weapons against opponents who carried steel. The Romans had perfected the art of graduated humiliation in the arena. Different types of disgrace called for different types of punishment, each calibrated to extract maximum shame while providing maximum entertainment for the crowd. A gladiator who refused to fight might be thrown to wild beasts, but not quickly. He would be tied to a post and left for the animals to toy with. His death prolonged for the amusement of the spectators. Those who showed cowardice faced even more elaborate punishments. They might be forced to fight as andabate gladiators who wore helmets without eye holes, stumbling blindly around the arena while the crowd laughed at their helplessness. Or they might be dressed as women and forced to fight with the weapons of the opposite sex, their masculinity stripped away along with their dignity. The psychological torture was as important as the physical punishment. Commodus was forced to watch from the arena's holding cells as his former comrades fought and died with honor. He saw the respect in the crowd's eyes for gladiators who faced death bravely, heard the cheers that had once been directed at him now given to others. He learned what it meant to be invisible in a place where visibility was everything. The other gladiators shunned him completely. In the brutal hierarchy of the arena, cowardice was the one unforgivable sin. Murderers, thieves, and rebels could earn respect through courage, but a coward was beyond redemption. His former friends refused to speak to him. His training partners turned their backs when he approached. His lovers found excuses to avoid his cell. When Commodus finally appeared in the arena again, it was as part of a naumachia, a mock naval battle where condemned criminals fought to the death on ships floating in the flooded arena. But his ship was deliberately sabotaged, its hull weakened so that it would sink quickly, its weapons dulled so that its crew could offer no real resistance. He was not there to fight, but to drown, his death serving as comic relief between more serious combats. The crowd's reaction was everything the punishment was designed to achieve. They laughed as Commodus struggled in the water, jeered as he tried to climb onto other ships, cheered when he was finally pulled under by the weight of his armor. His death was not tragic or heroic, it was merely pathetic, a fitting end for a man who had forgotten what it meant to be a gladiator. But even in death, the humiliation continued. Commodus's body was not given the ritual burial accorded to gladiators who died with honor. Instead, it was dragged from the arena by hooks, like the carcass of a slaughtered animal, and thrown into the mass grave reserved for criminals and slaves. No monument marked his resting place, no inscription recorded his victories, no mourners gathered to honor his memory. The empty space in the gladiator barracks where Commodus had once slept served as a permanent reminder to the other fighters of what awaited those who showed cowardice. New recruits were told his story as part of their training, learning that in the arena, death was preferable to dishonor, that a quick end was better than a slow degradation. The system worked exactly as it was designed to. Gladiators fought with desperate courage, knowing that cowardice would bring not just death, but something worse, the complete destruction of their identity. The transformation from warrior to victim, from hero to laughingstock. The arena had become a laboratory for studying the limits of human dignity, a place where shame was refined into an art form as precise as any sculpture. Years later, when the Flavian amphitheater crumbled and the gladiator schools closed, the story of Commodus lived on in the memories of those who had witnessed his fall. It became a cautionary tale told wherever men gathered to test their courage against death. A reminder that in Rome, there were always fates worse than dying, humiliations that could follow a man beyond the grave. In the villa of Senator Marcus Crassus Frugi, where marble statues gazed down from alcoves and frescoes, depicted scenes of mythological virtue, a different kind of trial was about to begin. Livia Drusilla, not the empress, but a senator's wife who had taken the name in an ill-fated attempt to claim imperial connections, stood before a tribunal that would judge not just her actions, but her very nature as a Roman woman. The charge was adultery, but in Rome, a woman's sexual transgression was never simply a private matter. It was a crime against the state, a violation of the social order that threatened the very foundations of civilization. For a married woman to commit adultery was to corrupt the bloodlines that determined inheritance, citizenship, and political legitimacy. It was treason disguised as passion. The punishment for female adultery was designed with exquisite precision to attack everything that Roman society valued in women. Livia would be stripped not just of her marriage, but of her very identity as a respectable matron. The stola, the long dignified dress that marked her as a married woman of good standing, would be replaced with the short tunic of a prostitute. Her hair, once elaborately arranged and adorned with pins of gold and ivory, would be shorn like a slave's, But the true cruelty lay in the systematic destruction of her social existence. Roman law required that an adulteress be divorced by her husband, not as a matter of choice, but as a legal obligation. Marcus Frugi, who had loved his wife despite her failings, was forced to repudiate her publicly, to declare before witnesses that she was no longer worthy to bear his name or share his bed. The repudium, the formula of divorce, was spoken in the atrium of the family home, before an audience of relatives, clients, and neighbors. "Take your things and go," Marcus said, his voice breaking on the ancient words. "You are no longer my wife." The legal phrase was simple, but its implications were devastating. Livia was not just losing a husband, she was losing her place in Roman society, her protection under law, her very right to exist as a respectable woman. The confiscation of property that followed was equally systematic. Under Roman law, an adulteress forfeited half her dowry to her husband and half to the state. Her jewelry, her clothing, her personal slaves, everything that had marked her status as a wealthy matron, was inventoried and redistributed. She was left with only the most basic necessities, reduced to the level of a freedwoman, dependent on charity for survival. But perhaps the most devastating punishment was the loss of her children. Roman law gave fathers absolute authority over their offspring, and an adulteress had no legal claim to her own sons and daughters. Livia was forced to watch as her children were told that their mother was dead to them, that they must never speak her name or acknowledge her existence. The bonds of motherhood, which Romans considered sacred, were severed as completely as if she had never given birth. The public nature of the punishment was carefully calculated. Livia's disgrace was not hidden away in private courts, but displayed for all to see. She was forced to appear in public wearing the clothes of a prostitute, her shorn head marking her as a woman who had forfeited her claim to respectability. Shopkeepers refused to serve her. Former friends crossed the street to avoid her. Children pointed and whispered as she passed. The Romans had developed an entire vocabulary of female shame, different punishments for different transgressions against feminine virtue. A woman who committed adultery faced one set of humiliations, while one who practiced magic faced another. Prostitutes who tried to pass themselves off as respectable matrons were forced to wear distinctive clothing and forbidden to appear in certain parts of the city. Women who bore children out of wedlock were marked with special tattoos that identified them as sexually impure. The toga itself became an instrument of punishment for women. While respectable matrons wore the stola, prostitutes and adulteresses were required to wear the toga, the garment of male citizens, as a mark of their sexual transgression. The message was clear. Women who violated sexual norms had forfeited their claim to femininity and would be treated as neither male nor female, but as something in between, something unnatural and shameful. Religious punishments for women were particularly elaborate. The Vestal Virgins, priestesses whose sexual purity was considered essential to Rome's survival, faced burial alive if they broke their vows of chastity. The punishment was carried out with ritual precision. The guilty Vestal was dressed in funeral garments, placed in an underground chamber with a small amount of food and water, and left to die slowly in the darkness. It was death disguised as mercy, since technically she was not executed, but simply abandoned to the will of the gods. Female slaves faced their own particular humiliations. A slave woman who tried to seduce her master's son might be branded on the forehead with the letter M for meretrix whore. A house slave who stole from her mistress could be forced to wear a metal collar inscribed with her crime, marking her permanently as untrustworthy. The punishments were designed not just to deter crime, but to reinforce the absolute authority of the household's male head. The psychological impact of these punishments extended far beyond their immediate victims. Every woman in Rome lived with the knowledge that her reputation, her security, her very identity depended on maintaining the appearance of virtue. The slightest scandal could destroy a lifetime of careful behavior, reducing a respected matron to the level of a street prostitute in a matter of days. Mothers used the stories of disgraced women to educate their daughters about the importance of chastity and obedience. "Look what happened to Livia Drusilla," they would say, pointing to a beggar woman in the street. "She forgot her place, and now she has no place at all." The lessons were reinforced by the visible presence of punished women in the city streets, living reminders of what awaited those who transgressed against feminine virtue. The system created its own momentum. Women policed each other's behavior as strictly as any magistrate, reporting suspicious activities, spreading gossip about potential transgressions, competing to demonstrate their own virtue by exposing others' failings. The fear of punishment became a form of social control more effective than any law, turning every woman into both potential victim and potential enforcer. For Livia, the punishment achieved exactly what it was designed to do. She disappeared from respectable society as completely as if she had died, her name becoming a cautionary tale told to warn other women about the price of sexual transgression. Her children grew up believing their mother was dead. Her husband remarried within the year, and her former friends learned to speak of her only in whispers, if at all. The empty chair at dinner parties where Livia had once sat served as a more powerful deterrent than any law or lecture. It reminded every woman present that their place in society was conditional, that their security depended on maintaining not just the reality of virtue, but its appearance. In Rome, a woman's reputation was like a mirror once cracked. It could never be made whole again. In the gardens of Nero, where exotic plants from across the empire bloomed in carefully tended beds, a different kind of flower was about to bloom human torches that would burn through the night to illuminate the emperor's party. The year was 64 CE, and Rome was still smoldering from the great fire that had consumed much of the city. Someone had to be blamed, and Nero had found the perfect scapegoats: the Christians. The punishment of religious dissidents in Rome was never simply about theology. It was about power, about the absolute authority of the state over the souls, as well as the bodies of its subjects. To refuse to honor the Roman gods was to reject the very foundations of imperial authority, to declare oneself an enemy of civilization itself. Marcus Flavius Clemens, a different man from the one we met earlier, but sharing the same fate, had been a successful merchant before his conversion. His crime was not theft or murder, but something far more dangerous in Roman eyes. He had refused to burn incense before a statue of the emperor, had declared that there was only one God, and that Caesar was merely a man. The punishment chosen for Christian martyrs was designed with theatrical precision. They would not simply be executed, they would be transformed into entertainment. Their deaths choreographed to provide maximum spectacle while delivering a clear message about the fate of those who rejected Roman authority. Clemens and his fellow Christians were brought into the gardens as the sun set, their bodies already prepared for their final performance. They had been covered in pitch and tar, transformed into human candles that would burn slowly and brightly through the night. Some were tied to posts, others suspended from trees, all positioned to provide the best possible illumination for the emperor's guests. The crowd that gathered was not there for religious instruction, but for entertainment. They came to see spectacle, to witness the power of Rome over those who dared to defy it. The Christians' deaths were not martyrdom in their eyes, but justice, the natural consequence of rejecting the gods who had made Rome great. Nero himself moved among his guests, pointing out particularly effective torches, commenting on the quality of the light they provided. He had transformed execution into art, martyrdom into interior decoration. The Christians' final moments became part of the evening's entertainment, their agony choreographed to coincide with the serving of wine and delicacies. The psychology of religious persecution was more sophisticated than simple cruelty. The Romans understood that martyrs could become more dangerous dead than alive, that persecution could strengthen rather than weaken religious movements. The solution was to strip martyrdom of its dignity, to transform it into comedy, to make the martyrs themselves complicit in their own humiliation. Some Christians were forced to reenact mythological scenes before their deaths, dressed as gods and heroes from the very pantheon they had rejected. They died as Hercules, as Orpheus, as Daedalus, their final moments transformed into pagan theater. The message was clear. Even in death, they served Rome's purposes, their bodies becoming props in stories that celebrated the very gods they had denied. Others were thrown to wild beasts, but not in the straightforward manner of common criminals. They were dressed as animals themselves, sewn into the skins of bears and deer, their humanity stripped away before they were torn apart. The crowd saw not the death of fellow human beings, but the destruction of creatures that had already forfeited their claim to human dignity. The arena became a laboratory for studying the limits of faith. How much torture could a believer endure before renouncing their God? How many of their children would they watch die before agreeing to burn incense to Caesar? The Romans approached these questions with scientific precision, calibrating punishments to break spirits as well as bodies. Some Christians broke under the pressure, publicly renouncing their faith to save their lives or their families. These lapsi, the fallen, faced a different kind of punishment. They were allowed to live but forced to serve as examples of the futility of resistance. They were paraded before other Christians as proof that faith was no match for Roman determination, that even the most devout believers would eventually choose life over principle. The persecution of Christians revealed the Romans' sophisticated understanding of crowd psychology. Public executions were timed to coincide with festivals and holidays, when the largest audiences would be available. They had been covered in pitch and tar, transformed into human candles that would burn slowly and brightly through the night. Some were tied to posts, others suspended from trees, all positioned to provide the best possible illumination for the emperor's guests. The crowd that gathered was not there for religious instruction, but for entertainment. They came to see spectacle, to witness the power of Rome over those who dared to defy it. The Christians' deaths were not martyrdom in their eyes, but justice, the natural consequence of rejecting the gods who had made Rome great. Nero himself moved among his guests, pointing out particularly effective torches, commenting on the quality of the light they provided. He had transformed execution into art, martyrdom into interior decoration. The Christians' final moments became part of the evening's entertainment, their agony choreographed to coincide with the serving of wine and delicacies. The psychology of religious persecution was more sophisticated than simple cruelty. The Romans understood that martyrs could become more dangerous dead than alive, that persecution could strengthen rather than weaken religious movements. The solution was to strip martyrdom of its dignity, to transform it into comedy, to make the martyrs themselves complicit in their own humiliation. Some Christians were forced to reenact mythological scenes before their deaths, dressed as gods and heroes from the very pantheon they had rejected. They died as Hercules, as Orpheus, as Daedalus, their final moments transformed into pagan theater. The message was clear. Even in death, they served Rome's purposes, their bodies becoming props in stories that celebrated the very gods they had denied. Others were thrown to wild beasts, but not in the straightforward manner of common criminals. They were dressed as animals themselves, sewn into the skins of bears and deer, their humanity stripped away before they were torn apart. The crowd saw not the death of fellow human beings, but the destruction of creatures that had already forfeited their claim to human dignity. The arena became a laboratory for studying the limits of faith. How much torture could a believer endure before renouncing their God? How many of their children would they watch die before agreeing to burn incense to Caesar? The Romans approached these questions with scientific precision, calibrating punishments to break spirits as well as bodies. Some Christians broke under the pressure, publicly renouncing their faith to save their lives or their families. These lapsi, the fallen, faced a different kind of punishment. They were allowed to live but forced to serve as examples of the futility of resistance. They were paraded before other Christians as proof that faith was no match for Roman determination, that even the most devout believers would eventually choose life over principle. The persecution of Christians revealed the Romans' sophisticated understanding of crowd psychology. Public executions were timed to coincide with festivals and holidays, when the largest audiences would be available. The methods of execution were chosen not just for their cruelty, but for their entertainment value. The crowd's reaction was carefully managed, with professional cheerleaders planted throughout the audience to ensure the proper response. Children were brought to witness these spectacles as part of their education. They learned that loyalty to Rome was not optional, that religious diversity was treason, that the price of defying imperial authority was not just death, but the complete destruction of human dignity. The lessons were reinforced by the visible suffering of the martyrs, by the contrast between their agony and the comfort of those who remained loyal to the traditional gods. But the persecution of Christians also revealed the limits of Roman power. Despite the elaborate punishments, despite the public humiliations, despite the systematic attempt to strip martyrdom of its dignity, the Christian movement continued to grow. Each execution created new converts. Each humiliation inspired new acts of defiance. The Romans found themselves caught in a paradox of their own making. The more spectacular the punishments, the more attention they drew to the very beliefs they were meant to suppress. The more public the executions, the more opportunities they provided for Christians to demonstrate their faith. The arena, designed to break spirits, instead became a stage where martyrs could display a courage that impressed even their executioners. In the end, the persecution of Christians became a testament to the limits of humiliation as a tool of social control. The Romans could destroy bodies, could strip away dignity, could transform death into entertainment. But they could not destroy the ideas that gave meaning to suffering, could not humiliate those who found glory in martyrdom, could not silence voices that grew stronger in death than they had ever been in life. The gardens of Nero, where Christians had burned like torches to light an emperor's party, eventually became the site of a Christian basilica. The flames that were meant to consume faith instead illuminated its power. The humiliations intended to destroy belief instead demonstrated its strength. Rome had learned that there were some things that even the most elaborate punishments could not touch. Some victories that could only be won by those willing to lose everything. In the marble halls of the Basilica Julia, where Rome's commercial disputes were settled with the precision of military campaigns, Marcus Tullius Maximus faced a reckoning that would strip away not just his wealth, but his very identity as a Roman citizen. The merchant who had once commanded fleets of grain ships from Alexandria now stood before his creditors wearing the rough tunic of a debtor, his senatorial ring confiscated, his name about to be erased from the rolls of respectable society. Debt in Rome was not simply a financial obligation, it was a moral failing that could destroy a man as completely as any crime. The Romans believed that a citizen who could not manage his own affairs was unfit to participate in the governance of the empire. Bankruptcy was not just economic failure but civic death, a form of social suicide that carried consequences more devastating than physical punishment. Maximus's downfall had begun with ambition. A successful trader in olive oil and wine, he had borrowed heavily to finance a fleet of ships that would carry Egyptian grain to Rome's hungry masses. The profits would have been enormous. Grain speculation was one of the few ways a merchant could rival the wealth of senators. But the ships had been caught in a storm off Crete, their cargoes lost, their hulls scattered across the Mediterranean floor. The creditors who gathered in the basilica represented every level of Roman society. There were senators who had invested their surplus capital, equities who had seen an opportunity for profit, even freedmen who had scraped together their savings to buy a share in what had seemed like a certain success. Now they faced the prospect of losing everything, and their anger was focused on the man who had promised them riches and delivered only ruin. The Bonorum Venditio, the sale of goods, was conducted with the same ceremony as a religious ritual. Maximus was forced to stand in the center of the basilica while his possessions were catalogued and auctioned. His villa on the Palatine Hill, his country estate in Campania, his collection of Greek statues and Egyptian antiquities, everything that had marked his status as a wealthy. Romung was reduced to items in an inventory, lots to be sold to the highest bidder. But the true humiliation lay not in the loss of property, but in the systematic destruction of his social identity. Roman law required that a bankrupt debtor surrender not just his possessions, but his civic rights. Maximus was stripped of his citizenship, reduced to the status of a peregrinus, a foreigner in his own city. He lost the right to vote, to hold office, to make legal contracts, even to marry legally. The Romans had developed an elaborate system of debt slavery that was designed to extract maximum labor while providing maximum humiliation. Maximus was not sold to a single master, but assigned to his creditors in proportion to what he owed them. He would spend his days working in the shops and warehouses of men who had once been his social inferiors, his nights sleeping in the slave quarters of houses where he had once been an honored guest. The psychological torture was exquisite in its precision. Maximus was forced to serve wine at dinner parties where his former friends discussed business deals he could no longer participate in. He cleaned the floors of the Forum where he had once walked as a respected citizen. He carried messages between merchants who had once competed for his favor, his presence a constant reminder of how quickly fortune could change in Rome. The Romans understood that economic punishment was most effective when it was public and permanent. Maximus was required to wear a distinctive cap that marked him as a debt slave, ensuring that everyone who saw him would know his status. His former name was forbidden to him. He was now simply service, slave, his individual identity erased along with his wealth. The system served multiple purposes beyond simple debt collection. It provided a constant reminder to other merchants of the risks of speculation, a living example of what happened to those who overreached their capabilities. It reinforced the social hierarchy by demonstrating that wealth without wisdom was worthless, that true nobility came not from possessions, but from character. Some debt slaves managed to work their way back to freedom, saving every coin they earned, slowly buying back their liberty from their creditors. But even those who regained their legal freedom never fully recovered their social position. They remained marked men, their bankruptcy a permanent stain on their reputation that could never be completely erased. Others were broken by the experience, their spirits crushed by the daily humiliation of serving those they had once commanded. They died in slavery, their bodies burned on pyres outside the city walls, their names forgotten by all but the accountants who struck them from the final ledgers. The children of bankrupt debtors faced their own particular punishments. They were forbidden to inherit their father's debts, but they also inherited his shame. They grew up knowing that their family name was associated with failure, that they would have to work twice as hard as their peers to achieve half as much respect. Some changed their names, fled to distant provinces, tried to start new lives where their father's disgrace was unknown. The wives of debt slaves occupied a particularly precarious position. They were not legally responsible for their husband's debts, but they shared in his social death. Former friends shunned them. Their children were excluded from the best schools. Their marriage prospects, if they divorced their ruined husbands, were severely limited. Many chose to follow their husbands into poverty rather than face the isolation of respectable widowhood. The Roman system of economic punishment was so effective that it became a model copied throughout the empire. Provincial cities adopted similar laws, creating a network of financial accountability that stretched from Britain to Egypt. The threat of debt slavery became a powerful tool for maintaining social order, ensuring that merchants and traders would think carefully before taking risks that could endanger not just their own fortunes, but the savings of their fellow citizens. The empty chair in the Senate where Maximus had once sat served as a permanent reminder of the price of financial failure. New senators were shown the vacant seat as part of their orientation, told the story of the man who had lost everything through reckless speculation. The lesson was clear. In Rome, economic failure was not just personal tragedy but civic crime, deserving of punishment as severe as any other betrayal of public trust. Years later, when the financial crisis that had destroyed Maximus was just a memory, his story continued to be told in the markets and counting houses of Rome. Merchants used his name as a curse, a warning against the dangers of ambition unchecked by prudence. "Don't be a Maximus," they would say when a colleague proposed a risky venture. The man himself was forgotten, but his failure lived on as a permanent part of Roman commercial culture. The system had achieved exactly what it was designed to do. It had transformed individual bankruptcy into collective education, personal ruin into public instruction. The Romans had discovered that economic humiliation could be as effective as physical punishment in maintaining social order, that the threat of financial disgrace could control behavior as surely as the fear of the cross or the arena. As the sun sets over the eternal city, casting long shadows across the forum where so many of our stories have unfolded, we must ask ourselves, what did it all mean? Why did Rome invest so much creativity, so much energy, so much systematic thought into the art of human humiliation? The answer lies not in cruelty for its own sake, but in the cold calculation of an empire that understood something fundamental about human nature. Rome was not built by the sword alone. It was built by the careful application of shame, by the systematic use of humiliation as a tool of social control. Every public punishment, every elaborate execution, every carefully calibrated degradation served a purpose beyond the immediate satisfaction of justice. They were lessons written in blood and tears, textbooks of power that taught millions of subjects exactly what it meant to be Roman and what it cost to forget. The genius of Roman punishment lay not in its severity, but in its precision. Where other civilizations relied on crude displays of force, Rome developed a science of shame that could be adjusted to fit any crime, any criminal, any lesson that needed to be taught. A senator faced different humiliations than a slave. A soldier different degradations than a merchant. A woman different shamas than a man. Each punishment was crafted like a key designed to unlock specific fears, to attack particular vulnerabilities, to destroy carefully chosen aspects of identity. This systematic approach to humiliation created what we might call a pedagogy of power, a curriculum of control that taught every person in the empire their place in the great hierarchy of Roman society. The crucified slaves along the Appian Way taught lessons about rebellion. The exiled poets in distant provinces demonstrated the price of offending imperial sensibilities. The branded foreheads of escaped slaves reminded everyone of the consequences of forgetting one's station. But perhaps most importantly, Roman punishment created what modern scholars call a culture of complicity. Every citizen who watched a public execution, every spectator who cheered at the games, every neighbor who shunned a disgraced family became part of the system. The punishments worked not just because they were severe, but because they transformed the entire population into enforcers of imperial will. The crowds that gathered to watch crucifixions were not passive observers, but active participants in the process of social control. Their cheers and jeers, their approval and condemnation, their very presence validated the system and made it effective. A crucifixion with no audience was just a death. A crucifixion with a crowd was a lesson that would be remembered and retold for generations. This culture of complicity extended far beyond the arena and the execution ground. It permeated every aspect of Roman society, creating a network of surveillance and enforcement that made formal policing almost unnecessary. Neighbors watched neighbors, slaves reported on masters, children informed on parents. The fear of punishment was so pervasive, so deeply internalized, that most Romans policed themselves more effectively than any magistrate could have done. The Romans understood something that modern societies often forget, that the most effective form of control is self-control, that the most powerful punishments are those that people inflict on themselves. By creating a system where shame was more feared than death, where social ostracism was worse than physical pain, they built an empire that could control hearts and minds as well as bodies and territories. The legal framework that supported this system was as sophisticated as any modern code of justice. Roman law distinguished between different types of shame, different degrees of humiliation, different categories of social death. The infamia that destroyed a person's legal standing was carefully differentiated from the ignominia that attacked their personal reputation. The deportatio that stripped away citizenship was distinct from the relegatio that merely imposed exile. This legal precision allowed Roman magistrates to calibrate punishments with scientific accuracy. They could destroy a person's political career without touching their personal wealth, eliminate their social standing while preserving their legal rights, or strip away their civic identity while leaving their family relationships intact. The punishment could be made to fit not just the crime, but the specific lesson that needed to be taught. The effectiveness of this system can be measured in the longevity of the empire itself. Rome endured for over 1,000 years, governing territories that stretched from Scotland to Sudan, controlling populations that spoke hundreds of languages and worshipped thousands of gods. No empire before or since has achieved such geographic scope or temporal duration. While military might and administrative efficiency certainly played their roles, the systematic use of shame as a tool of control was equally important to Roman success. The punishments we have examined were not aberrations or excesses. They were essential features of the Roman system, as important to imperial success as roads, aqueducts, or legions. They created a shared understanding of power and submission that transcended cultural and linguistic differences, a common vocabulary of fear and respect that could be understood from Hadrian's Wall to the Euphrates frontier. But the Roman system of punishment also contained the seeds of its own destruction. The very effectiveness of shame as a tool of control created vulnerabilities that would eventually be exploited by those who refused to be shamed. Christianity, with its celebration of martyrdom and its transformation of suffering into victory, represented a direct challenge to the Roman understanding of humiliation. When Christians sang hymns while burning as human torches, when they competed for the privilege of dying in the arena, when they treated exile and degradation as honors rather than punishments, they revealed the limits of shame as a form of social control. They showed that there were some people who could not be humiliated, some beliefs that could not be destroyed by public ridicule, some forms of identity that grew stronger under persecution. The irony is that Christianity eventually adopted many of the same techniques that Rome had used against it. The medieval church developed its own elaborate systems of public penance, its own methods of social ostracism, its own ways of using shame to control behavior. The Inquisition, with its public trials and elaborate punishments, bore a striking resemblance to the Roman judicial spectacles we have examined. In this sense, Rome's greatest victory was not military or political but cultural. The empire fell, but its methods of social control lived on, adapted and refined by successive civilizations. The basic insight that shame could be more powerful than force, that humiliation could be more effective than violence, became part of the DNA of Western civilization. Every public trial, every media scandal, every social media pylon carries echoes of the Roman understanding that reputation is more fragile than life itself. The psychological sophistication of Roman punishment also anticipated many modern insights about human behavior. The Romans understood, centuries before the development of formal psychology, that identity is socially constructed, that shame is more powerful than guilt, that public humiliation can destroy a person more completely than private suffering. They knew that humans are fundamentally social creatures, that our sense of self depends on the recognition and respect of others. By systematically attacking these social bonds, by isolating individuals from their communities, by transforming them from subjects into objects, Roman punishments achieved a level of psychological destruction that purely physical torture could never match. The modern reader, comfortable in societies that pride themselves on human rights and individual dignity, might be tempted to dismiss Roman punishments as relics of a more barbarous age. But this would be a mistake. The techniques we have examined, public shaming, social ostracism, the systematic destruction of reputation, remain powerful tools of control in contemporary society. The internet has created new possibilities for public humiliation, that the Romans could never have imagined. A single photograph, a careless comment, a moment of poor judgment can now be broadcast to millions of people instantly, creating a form of global pillory that makes the Roman Forum look intimate by comparison. The viral video, the Twitter mob, the cancel culture phenomenon, all of these represent evolution rather than abandonment of Roman techniques. What has changed is not the human capacity for cruelty or the effectiveness of shame as a tool of control, but rather our understanding of the moral implications of these techniques. We have developed concepts of human dignity, individual rights, and proportional justice that make the Roman system seem not just harsh, but fundamentally wrong. Yet even as we condemn Roman cruelty, we continue to use many of the same methods in more subtle forms. Our criminal justice system relies heavily on shame and social stigma to deter crime. Our media culture thrives on the public destruction of celebrities and politicians who fall from grace. Our social institutions, schools, workplaces, communities all use various forms of humiliation to enforce conformity and punish deviance. The Roman legacy is visible not just in our punitive institutions, but in our entertainment as well. Reality television shows that humiliate contestants for public amusement, social media platforms that encourage public shaming, news programs that turn personal scandals into mass entertainment. All of these can trace their lineage back to the amphitheaters and forums of ancient Rome. We have inherited the Roman understanding that there is something deeply satisfying about watching the powerful brought low, something cathartic about witnessing the destruction of those who have transgressed against the social norms. The crowds that gathered to watch gladiatorial games were not fundamentally different from the audiences that tune in to watch celebrity downfalls or political scandals unfold. But perhaps the most important lesson we can draw from the Roman system of punishment is the recognition that shame, while powerful, is not always just. The Romans used humiliation so effectively that they sometimes forgot to ask whether their victims deserved such treatment. The system became an end in itself, a machine for producing spectacle that operated independently of any coherent theory of justice. The Christians who burned in Nero's gardens, the slaves who died along the Appian Way, the exiles who wasted away in distant provinces, many of these people were guilty of nothing more than challenging the assumptions of their society, of refusing to accept the roles that had been assigned to them. Their punishments tell us more about Roman insecurity than about Roman justice, more about the empire's need to control than about the victims' need to be controlled. This is perhaps the most sobering lesson of all, that the capacity for systematic cruelty exists in all human societies, that the techniques of humiliation can be refined and perfected by any civilization, that the difference between justice and oppression often lies not in the methods used, but in the purposes they serve. The Romans were not uniquely evil, they were uniquely systematic. They took the human capacity for shame and cruelty and organized it, rationalized it, turned it into a science of social control. In doing so, they created a template that has been copied, adapted, and refined by countless societies since. Today, as we grapple with questions of justice and punishment in our own societies, we would do well to remember the Roman example not as a model to emulate, but as a warning about the dangers of allowing efficiency to trump humanity, of permitting the means of control to become more important than the ends of justice. The empty spaces in the Roman Forum, where crowds once gathered to watch their fellow humans destroyed for entertainment, now serve as monuments to a different kind of lesson. They remind us that civilizations are judged not by their power to punish, but by their wisdom to restrain that power, not by their ability to humiliate, but by their commitment to preserve human dignity, even in the face of wrongdoing. The stones of Rome still stand, weathered by centuries but enduring. The punishments we have examined are long forgotten, their victims reduced to names in history books or anonymous bones in unmarked graves. But the questions they raise about power and justice, about shame and dignity, about the proper relationship between the individual and the state, remain as relevant today as they were 2,000 years ago. In the end, the Roman system of punishment succeeded too well. It created an empire that could control bodies and minds with unprecedented efficiency. But it also created a society that forgot the difference between order and oppression, between justice and vengeance, between punishment and entertainment. The empire that perfected the art of humiliation ultimately humiliated itself, becoming a cautionary tale about the dangers of power unchecked by mercy. As we leave the ruins of the Forum, where so many of our stories unfolded, we carry with us the voices of those who suffered and died here, not as entertainment for crowds, but as witnesses to the human capacity for both cruelty and courage, for both degradation and dignity. Their stories remind us that while the techniques of humiliation may evolve, the human spirit's capacity to transcend shame remains constant. The greatest punishment Rome ever inflicted was on itself, the gradual erosion of the very values it claimed to defend, the slow corruption of justice into spectacle, the transformation of citizens into audiences for cruelty. In perfecting the art of humiliation, Rome forgot the art of mercy. In learning to destroy dignity, it lost its own. This is the final lesson of Roman punishment, that a civilization's true strength lies not in its ability to shame and humiliate, but in its capacity to preserve human dignity even in the darkest moments, to find justice without sacrificing mercy, to maintain order without destroying the very humanity it seeks to protect. The empire of shame has fallen. The stones remember. And we, the inheritors of both Roman wisdom and Roman folly, must choose which legacy to carry forward into our own uncertain future.